समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया.
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले. दिस इज द राइट टाइम.
अब समझा.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
So welcome to the final episode for 2025 for the Worldview with Swasti. It has been exactly a year since we launched this program, and the world had been unpredictable then. In fact, 2024 was considered to be a year that everybody felt global fatigue and from unending wars, etc. But if 2024 was problematic, 2025 has been perpetual crisis, and unexpected realignments have taken shape. In order to understand how to make sense of 2025 from a global perspective, and particularly from India's perspective, as we are in the middle of a very volatile neighborhood, many of our strategic calculus, with respect to US is not working out the manner in which we expected. I'm here today in studio with Professor Raja Mohan. He needs no introduction. He's India's foremost strategic thinker. Dr. Raja Mohan, thanks for taking the
Thank you,
time out.
Swasti. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you
and for joining us at for this special year-ender. And all of us are trying to make sense of what to call 2025. And if I may just ask here, we have an aspiration of becoming a developed nation by 2047. We have a complicated neighborhood. It's always been like that. But then there's also a major, geopolitical realignment in the offing, and no predictions seem to work right now. What is it that we have to unlearn to relearn in order to, really get some predictability back in our strategic calculus?
Well, I think on the question of becoming a developed state, Viksit Bharat by 2047, the focus has to be on the economic. That is, unless you accelerate your internal transformation, reform the way we've done business on a whole range of sectors, I think that goal cannot be achieved by clever diplomatic play. Because you don't have control over the world's events. What you have control over is your own policies.
Right.
And I think many of the reforms that have been long overdue. So now the government actually in the last few weeks has begun to do some reforms, which it was previously were not done, whether it was getting rid of some laws, GST reform, you had this nuclear reform, for example.
The civil
so I think
nuclear
it's
liability.
really, what you have control over is your own policies. And I think there's no alternative to keep changing, keep modernizing your own systems. And if you can ramp up your economic growth to 7-8%, and today we're touching around 7, then I think your ability to deal with a more complex, volatile, and uncertain world will be easier. Because if you're a bigger market, if you're bigger GDP, you're bigger per capita GDP, your ability to cope with unexpected changes will be much better, rather than simply saying, look, everybody should be nice to me or I'll be nice to everyone. That just doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad we started with economy because, of course, just now IMF released its figures and India has been growing quite steady, I would say. But again, now let's just try to declutter it a little bit, because even though we are at about now 4 trillion of GDP, but the per capita remains a challenge. And especially when you remove the top 1% of that per capita, it becomes a bigger challenge. So it's not percolating down, it's not really percolating down to the people that really require to sort of, rev up our economic growth and potential. That's one part. Manufacturing, when you look in proportion to the GDP, has been rather stagnant. Unless and until we get manufacturing in India, that was the objective of Make in India, if you remember. We are not going to be able to make use of China plus one diversification. Similarly, if you look at R&D has always been our undoing. If you look at investments, so just in 2025, of course, investments have rebounded. But if you look at in proportion to GDP, it's almost nominal. How do we address these inconsistency, Professor Raja
I think
Mohan?
these are all domestic policy issues. And I think every one of them has a specific set of context. So I think in the last few years, there's been so much focus on diplomacy and,
Okay.
the doctrine of diplomacy that I think there's been hesitation internally to actually do things. For example, the nuclear reform. You signed the nuclear deal in 2005 to 8.
Yes, yeah.
Now, after that, I mean, we just didn't do anything. I mean, so I think this way the problem has been when the world is changing so rapidly, you need to do internal change, internal modernization to cope with the external world. But some areas, for example, on PLI, the manufacturing, today, the Chinese have almost 35% of the global manufacturing.
Right.
So they bring in a level of efficiency and price which nobody is able to match. So for that, I think the problem therefore would be how do you improve your business environment? How do you make it easier for people to do things? Though we've talked the talk of ease of business, actually anyone who does any business in this country knows there's one hell of a lot more to do. This where I think the talk about reducing deregulation, reducing what they're calling the regulatory cholesterol. All these are important. I mean, I think these from simple things like compliances, for example, when you and I say you write abroad for an article, you get $100, and
At
there's
least.
a kind of amount of work that is being demanded for simple things. This, I think, we are not in business, but those who are actually in business know how hard it is to get done. So I would say keep reforming, keep changing. Then I think we can look at the world in which you can improve. There, I would say the $4 trillion stuff, our rupees declining.
Yes.
Therefore, that's going to make it even harder to cross that 4 trillion.
Right.
Because in the end, this is really about, we're talking about nominal GDP that depends on, your exchange rates.
Yes.
But I think we are growing. So I think we're growing at 6 to 7%. So if not today, tomorrow, we'll cross 4 trillion, maybe eventually get to 5 and beyond. But the important thing is the 4 trillion, the macro GDP tells you your relative weight in the international system is growing. Actually, very few countries are doing that, actually, except China and India. Most other countries are really not growing at a level where things become, their position internationally will change. But I think a problem when you look at the per capita income is still below $3,000.
Yes.
So that tells you your amount of developmental work internally, both of equality, which you talked about, as well as the basic progress, that we have a long way to go to lift up the people of this country, to be able to proclaim yourself actually as a developed nation. Therefore, I would say both are important.
Okay.
How do you leverage your growing weight in the international system, that is your macro GDP, and how do you engage the world in a manner that you can lift up your own people towards more prosperity?
So those are, of course, very important suggestions, Dr. Raja Mohan. And let me now, because we are talking about, India's, I mean, our vantage point is here in New Delhi. Now, when we look around, I have to ask you about the neighborhood, because there's one thing that I keep referring to again and again, is again something that you phrased, which was India's response or India's foreign policy to our neighborhood remains sentimental and self-referential. And this is something which I think pretty much sums up in many ways. Let's just start from the neighborhood challenge. Of course, let's come to Bangladesh first, because Pakistan, of course, is going to open another Pandora's box of the Middle East and then further. Let's just start with Bangladesh first. As you know that we are now expecting elections, but then there's so much volatility. Again, there is instability. There's violence against minorities. But at the same time, there's also something larger which is getting realigned. We're constantly talking about this, grand realignment between Bangladesh and China and Pakistan in a manner which could be problematic for us. Let's just start from our neighborhood.
Look, I think two things when we come to the neighborhood. I mean, I think, as you said, look, we always think as if we have won the neighborhood or we've lost the neighborhood.
Yeah.
But our neighbors have a life of their own, So I think we got to understand they have their own politics, they have their own internal problems. Therefore, it's not about us alone.
Okay.
As a foreign policy, yes, how do we deal with the neighborhood? But I think if you look at the macro picture, I think to say, look, somebody's, we tend to say, look, Bangladesh, so-and-so is pro-India, so-and-so is anti-India. I think we're tending to see everything from, as I said, in a self-referential way. But I think we got to give those internal politics, even in the smallest country, like Maldives, they're groups, they're fighting, they're playing games with each other, they're playing games with the world. So you got to take that in your stride, which means actually there'll be ups and downs. That it is not as if you can control the domestic politics of your neighbors. You can't. And within them, they'll be going up and down. So some days your ties with Nepal are good, some days they're bad. For 15 years, we had very good relations with Bangladesh. Today, it's in a difficult situation. Pakistan is an exception. Things have been pretty bad for a long time. So here I would say to produce the structural change, again you come back to the economic aspect.
Right.
And whether we are using geography to the best effect. Now, for example, if Bangladesh has 4,000 kilometers of border with India,
Yeah.
and if we say China does more trade with them, there's something wrong with us.
Yeah.
So it's not the Chinese are genius. Okay, China is the second largest economy. They will be everywhere. So will be neighborhood. That if you say, look, Sri Lanka is next to me, Maldives is just a stone's throw from India, and Bangladesh, I got, Nepal is an open border. If you say that trade with China is more than yours, then something is wrong with us.
Yeah.
So it's not that Chinese are so brilliant that they've come undone. And I think partly historic here. The post-independence, the partition of the subcontinent was followed by an economic partition. All of us adopted socialist policies. We said, look, we're not interested in exports.
Yeah.
We're going to block imports. So in a way, actually, you abandon the natural geographic advantages that you had with your neighbors. Today, connectivity is a popular word. But if you go to see India-Nepal border, it's an open border, but it is very difficult to do business across it because you've not kept your infrastructure modernized. There are no real good roads. If you go to India-Bangladesh border, I mean, the long queues of actually these trucks are set out for miles.
Right.
So in a way, look, we have to, I would say that your economic policies have actually made it harder to integrate the region. So today, I think as India has opened up in the last 30 years, many of our neighbors have also opened up. Things have improved, I would say. The amount of volume of economic relationship that has increased, but it's still not its full potential because India has this huge number of non-tariff barriers. We don't give, whether it is America or Maldives, we don't want to make the right trade decisions or make concessions, as we say.
Well, because certain sectors in our economies remain to be so sensitive to any kind of competition from abroad.
That's where I think. That's where I think. So if you can't distinguish between US and Bhutan or US and Bangladesh, so your ability to actually integrate your neighboring economies into your economy, that is constantly tested. But things have improved. But I think if your economies work through the logic of geography, the logic of connectivity, then I think political change then would reduce the effects on the larger economic relationship. Right. And I think that's where promoting deeper interdependence over a period of time. And the willingness to look, we got to live with their traumas, their internal politics, rather than...
And their self-referentialism as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Absolutely. So I think we've got to be patient, and I don't think we should lose our, shouldn't get too into a panic saying, oh, suddenly Bangladesh is turning to China or Pakistan. Look, what can Pakistan do for Bangladesh? Beyond the optics of, say, anti-India platform. But the fact is, trade can only be with India.
Yeah.
If you have a better trade policies, and Pakistan, which has no border with Bangladesh,
right,
there's only this much they can do. China also does not have a border. So I would say patience, more enlightened economic policies will, I think, eventually bring the region together.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, because one of the challenges with the SAARC, of course, SAARC as an institution didn't work, but, South Asia or the Indian subcontinent remains the least integrated regions of the world.
Now, I would blame myself, I would blame ourselves. Look, SAARC is, if it is there, it's useful. But the fact is, look, India has borders with all the countries.
Yeah.
Pakistan, Bangladesh don't have a border. Pakistan, Nepal does not have a border.
Yeah.
So you don't need the SAARC to do regional integration.
Right.
That is, if you have good economic policies, if you have good trade policies, if your border is modernized, if your border is a trade facilitation improves, you don't need a SAARC.
Yeah.
So it's actually what India does on its own. But I think our policies of trade and commerce in our neighborhood have been so, hostile to deeper integration,
Right.
hostile to opening up our economy. So I think that's where it's really, if we do reform in those sectors.
And I think there's also this, I think there's one thing that we need to sort of get over um, with is, this constant so to say preoccupation with regime changes and CIA
Yeah.
operations and that operations. I mean, I think with the world is, I really would like to understand from you, Dr. Rajamohan, because
It's
I see
easy
so
to,
much preoccupation with these theories. And do you think they hold
it's
true? Do you
easy,
think?
it's easy, then you to
Okay.
see, it's very easy to blame somebody else.
Yeah. Okay.
Like if you say, look, in Bangladesh, as I said, look, if you have 4,000 kilometers of border, you had a
Yeah.
government that was friendly to you.
Yeah.
And if you didn't see what was coming, you can blame the rest of the world.
It will
But
still
we should
not
also
change
reflect
anything.
on how did we miss this?
Yeah.
How did we miss the popular sentiment, which was, after all, revolutions don't happen overnight.
Yes.
Regimes fall after a lot of dissatisfaction. So I think there again, unfortunately, there's less of self-reflection.
Yeah.
It's more easy to blame other people and regime changes. There's, somebody else's deep state. My question is, what the hell was our deep state doing? If you're the big,
If it is a deep state versus deep state, then
so
yes.
what were we doing in our own?
Okay.
In those are the issues. But I think more calm,
Yeah.
and more, shall we say, temperate way of doing things. For example, you remember the Maldives. So, oh my God, Maldives is, hostile to India. There was all that thing about, some groups in Maldives attacking India and all that. But you look at now, I mean, within a year, Maldives has become an important partner for India.
Right.
So I think we got to be patient. We got to be able to let them, make them feel comfortable rather than trying to impose our will at every minute. It doesn't work.
Now let's come to the more complicated neighbor, Pakistan. Now, a couple of things, of course, we don't need to go into the details of our problems. I think everybody understands the kind of structural problems we have with Pakistan. But let's just begin with reflecting on this dehyphenation, rehyphenation, that India, for the longest time, wanted to dehyphenate itself from Pakistan, projecting itself as the main growth story, the success story in this region. And then happens Pahalgam, followed by Operation Sindoor. And we see that Pakistan has been able to sort of, exploit it to its advantage. So you see that this was an unfinished war, and we also saw how the Indian Air Force did what it did in terms of perpetrating that damage and destruction to their airfields, etc. But somehow it is the first part of the Operation Sindoor that Pakistan has played very well. And long story short, it has sort of outmaneuvered India when it comes to diplomatic outreaches, etc. Now, for a country that is internally that unstable, with an economy faltering and all the problems that Pakistan has, how do you make sense of this rehyphenation that suddenly the world has sort of put on us?
I would say something, not popular thing to say, that we are rehyphenating ourselves.
Okay.
That we are, so obsessed with Pakistan that we tend to, constantly raise the Pakistan question, and it becomes part of your domestic political discourse. Look, on the economic sphere, there is no hyphenation today.
It is.
Yeah,
I mean, it would be very strange to compare.
Yeah, so there is
Yeah.
none. See, today
Yeah.
Indian GDP at 4 trillion.
Yeah.
Pakistan has been stuck at 400 billion for a long
500
time.
billion, yes, almost.
They're only barely growing at 2.5%.
Yeah.
So in a way, you already separated. You are the fourth largest economy, or whatever it is, or fifth, depending on the exchange rate. Pakistan is stuck. So Pakistan might have won the narrative on the first day. Pakistan might suddenly, Mr. Trump might like Pakistan, or my favorite field marshal, or Pakistan is going around in the Asimonade. But the fact is, look, your core strength vis-a-vis Pakistan is your economic strength. I think it is something we got to keep building on that. And how do we use that to strengthen ourselves rather than complaining about the other stuff that with Pakistan. For example, Pahalgam. I would say, look, Pakistan is a terror industry. Now, the question for us is not to either blame Pakistan, but the question is, how do I stop it?
Yeah.
How do I deter Pakistan's military adventure, which means modernizing your intelligence, strengthening your deterrence capabilities, making the border more secure, like Israelis, for example.
Yeah.
Intelligence is the first line of defense. Now, something happened at Pahalgam, somewhere things went wrong. Like you couldn't. So I would say, look, it's again being patient, building up your capabilities so that incidents like Pahalgam don't happen.
But Pahalgam then again was, of course, when it happened, of course, it was one of its kind because they came so deep inside Indian territory and all
the fact is that there's also an intelligence failure.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, absolutely. But then what I'm saying is that even after that, the kind of strategic posture that India took in terms of sort of having this proactive retaliation, or at least showing this willingness of proactive retaliation, not shying away from sort of mobilizing the air assets, etc. But just a few months later, then we had something repeating in Delhi, in the heart of Delhi. So when we look at our internal problems, the internal security problems, we see there has been a kind of a return of terrorism in a manner that was not there in the last few
Look,
years.
I think no country can fully
Agreed.
eliminate it.
Agreed.
So
Yeah.
the question is, how do you strengthen your deterrence?
Right.
For example, on when deterrence broke down, say. Now, what did the first day of Sindhu tell you? We have actually, our Air Force needs modernization.
Yeah.
The delays in acquisition.
Yeah.
And our own defense spending went down to 2% or less in the last 10 years.
And capital procurement is even lesser.
So
That's
I think,
been
so the problem then is, look, are we doing enough on defense?
Okay.
Is our forces capable of dealing with those kind of situations? These are the things, I think, in terms of, look, I'll worry about Pakistan if Pakistan is growing at 5%. Then your threat from Pakistan will grow. But in terms of terrorism, I think the government's policy of retaliating sometimes, but you can't retaliate every time. You can't every time an incident happens, you're not going to go to war with Pakistan.
Yeah.
So that's where I think intelligence, prevention, and creating enough military capabilities,
Right.
so that the next time something happens, if you engage Pakistan militarily, you should come out on top, which means you need a bigger military, a stronger military, bigger defense expenditure, more modern equipment. That is the real question. And not keep arguing with Pakistan, and getting into this tutu mame all the time. That's what rehyphenation is, because socially, politically you're rehyphenating, while actually economically your capabilities are much more, 10 times more than Pakistan's.
Yeah. So in some ways, when our Pakistan narrative is somewhere, punching up under our weight in that sense. Okay. Now, interesting, because we're coming to security, and one of the things that we are looking from 2024 to 2025 is also how there has been a global militarization of sorts, right? So in 2024, the global spending on defense was about 2.4 or 5 trillion or 2.7 trillion dollars. In next 10 years, the projections say that this is going to go to about $6.5 trillion. And every year, globally, we are going to be spending at least 8% more on defense and military modernization. In this regard, now I want to talk more about defense and security and those issues. On the one hand, you have United States, which is still by far the largest defense spender, the largest military superpower, with about $900 billion as their defense spending. On the other hand, you have China with about 300 billion, at least that's what we know. It may be more, but at 300 billion is what we know. And then comes India at about 75, 80 billion, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and all put together is still less than what China is spending on defense. And the question of Pakistan becomes a bit problematic, because it's not Pakistan alone. It's a Pakistan which is actively sort of backed and propped up by China. Then there's also another power called Turkey. Now, just in terms of the defense spending and the figures, we know that global militarization is here to stay. And then now let's talk about all the delays and stuff like that. Just before Pahalgam happened, I don't think people were really worried about or that alarmed about getting our capital procurement to at least 2% of our GDP. It's our entire budget has fallen to 2% or less. Dr. Raja Mohan, I personally see that if we are not able to get that house in order, we are not able to do anything else, because for economy to grow, we have to make sure that the borders are stable. What are your takes on that?
No, I think it's, look, when we talk about militarization is here to stay, I think we just at the beginning of that curve. For India, the Operation Sindhu is a wake-up call that we need to have a much bigger edge on Pakistan military forces, which means more rapid military modernization. And while we can't catch up with China, as you said, but we must develop the technologies that actually neutralize some of their advantages. Bigger gap over Pakistan, military gap, and closing the gap with China. I think those are the core functions. So
now, but we can't seem to do it alone, because when we look at domestically, we've been missing our deadlines.
I think a lot of it has been, again, the policies.
Okay.
if you take a decision, okay, I'll buy so many Rafales, just any fighter X, and you take 15 years to take that decision,
Right.
then the cost of that decision, you're already spending a lot more money. If you took a
Right.
decision, if you go to the Rafale process, went on, it started in 2005 or 6.
Actually, the
RFP.
requirement was actually projected in 2000, in the year 2000.
So look,
Okay,
now
and then the
if you take,
decision was
if you're so
yeah,
long to decide,
yeah,
then your cost of, everyone knows basic economics. The longer you know take a decision, the cost of that decision will go up.
yeah.
So I think that's as simple as that. But I think which means actually reforming your higher defense organization. There's been a lot of talk in the last year, certainly after Sindoor, how to improve your procurement policies. But I think the process is too slow still. So
Yeah.
there is no overall. That's one thing. Second, you kept your private sector away from defense. Which most countries, you use the private sector, its resources to make you stronger militarily. But as a policy choice, we kept them aside for the last 70 years. So I think the challenge for us is, look, how do you bring in the whole of the country approach
Right.
so that all the national resources can be brought in to deal with the security challenges?
Okay.
Partly expanded defense expenditure, partly letting your own society grow fully. For example, Sindoor, the whole talk about the startups and what they've done with the drones. But all these years, actually, you won't let them come anywhere near defense policies. Some changes are taking place. Some talk about reform. But I think given the scale of the problems we face from Pakistan and China, the need for a much faster, more sweeping, more comprehensive reform on the defense sector
Yeah.
is absolutely crucial.
Interesting you made that observation, Dr. Raja Mohan, but there's just one more thing. When India tends to look at co-producing defense equipment, of course, India's come a long way from being a buyer and to now, getting to co-production. There's also this sticking point always of the transfer of technology. We seem to be comfortable only with countries that are going to allow us to have the transfer of technology. I think it's a rather misunderstood term. Would you agree that there would be countries who are willing to easily dispense with their intellectual property and transfer of technology in the manner in which we seem to believe?
Look, I think nobody hands over a technology to you on a plate to say,
But
well,
that's
yeah,
what
yeah.
made Russia so important to
No,
us.
Russia also, the first aircraft we built in 1960. The MiG-21 deal was 1961. You still only screwdriver technology, right? You're not producing MiG-21 70 years later. You still take, each time you build another deal, license production rather than actually doing yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
Engines, after all these years, I mean, you still don't produce
Yeah, we are
engines.
dependent, yes.
So I think the important thing is to remember, look, no country gives away its technology.
Okay.
Second, when they give, actually, they're not going to, just because the government of India wants to hand it over,
Right.
they don't give. For example, the Western companies, they're operating as firms, as companies. So if you have actually your private sector collaborates with a Western entity, American or European, and in the process, the other side finds it useful as a commercial decision,
Right.
not as a political decision the bureaucrats are going to negotiate. But if it is commercially worthwhile for them to work with a Tata's or a L&T and say, look, it's good for them to share some technology with you and that they will benefit something out of it, then it will happen.
Okay.
A third level is that actually you have to do your reverse engineering. You have to create your ecosystem. But there again, I would say you didn't let your private sector grow. You kept it all the government departments.
And
whose
also within the government department, it remained very siloized.
Yeah,
So that's
absolutely.
another
Yeah, and then
problem.
you
Yeah.
think so. I think partly we are talking the talk again
Yeah, yeah.
of bringing in more private sector, bringing in more R&D, bringing in the reform. But I think the process is still very slow given the kind of challenges you face.
All right. Let's just now come to, of course, the Trump factor, because I'm sure you remember when Donald Trump was, when he was re-elected and he sort of came back to White House in January 2025. The mood was so upbeat, and in fact, in India, I think we were all very certain of a certain kind of a stability and all that from the United States. But then Donald Trump made tariffs the centerpiece of his economic policy, and he made mediation the centerpiece of his foreign policy in many ways, and of course transactionalism, etc. We have just talked so much about how to make sense of Donald Trump. There have been so many people trying to make sense of him. America under Donald Trump remains transactional. Under him, he's also showing a willingness to become more isolationist, and yet he's interfering everywhere, with respect to his mediation and stuff. How do we sort of engage Donald Trump? Because somewhere he's been disinterested, some so to say. Quad, I don't know where Quad is, when Quad summit is happening. So how do we make sense of the sudden indifference that we see? Not necessarily a disruption, but a sudden indifference, kind of an undermining of Indian interest. How do we take this forward?
I think Trump is not being especially difficult with
For
India.
us, yeah, he's difficult to
See, it's
everybody.
actually so. I think we got to understand the internal change that has taken place in Pakistan, and within that, Trump's look. I think the U.S. dissatisfaction with globalization and the WTO framework, which has led to re-questioning, I would say even 70 years of policy towards globalization. That's a fundamental change. So I would say that's actually far more serious. How the US is trying to change the global economic order and the global trading system. And I think we have difficulties. We still don't have a trade deal. So therefore, this is actually
What do you think is really coming in the way of a trade deal? Because as far as I remember, for the last 3 months, 4 months now, we keep hearing is it's just around the corner.
No, the fact is, look, till it's done, it's not done.
Okay.
So I think that's where we are. I think people say, look, it's on Trump's table. He has to take a call. So, but I think that's where his personality comes in, where his whole style of taking decisions, he's probably using it as a pressure tactic against India. But here is important thing, look, the structure of the global economy is fundamentally changing. That is the big lesson from 2025. And I think we have to adapt to that. And I think how we do that in the next few years is going to be a big challenge. Within that, whether trade deal comes with the Americans or not, I think we've seen India has accelerated its trade negotiations with the Europeans. We've signed an FTA with Britain,
With New
recently
Zealand.
with New Zealand. So I think the recognition that, look, you need to diversify, you need to create a widening set of partners. See, I'm not worried about the mediation issue. He can keep talking about mediation. See, mediation can only happen when you can force two people to come to the table, right?
No, I mean, what I meant to say was not necessarily in the context of India and Pakistan. I mean,
No,
in
no, that's
general,
what- no, look,
because every time Donald Trump says something about Russia-Ukraine war,
These
of
are
course,
all
in
fake,
India,
These are all fake peace deals, right?
Yeah.
You can say, look, I
Yeah.
brought Cambodia and Thailand
Thailand,
together.
yeah.
But they keep fighting. This look,
Yeah.
there is a maverick egotism
Yeah.
to Trump. So he thinks he can fix the world. If you could fix problems so easily, whether it is between Israel and Palestine or
Right.
between Russia and Ukraine or between India and Pakistan, come on, these have been going on for centuries. Some of them, the idea that one American president for 4 years can come and fix things. I mean, this is an illusion.
Yeah.
Sometimes leaders have their own illusions. I mean, I think we should just let it pass like that rather than take it too seriously.
Okay.
See, in the Indian case, look, we've had Americans trying to mediate since the 1949.
Oh,
on
of
Kashmir.
course, of
Yeah.
course. I mean, you
So
have
I
also
don't-
talked
yeah,
about
so I
it a
think we
lot.
should dismiss
Yes.
it. Look, you are a big country. If you say you're a $4 trillion economy, you're fourth largest economy, who is going to push you? So this idea that somebody is going to push you into a deal with Pakistan, nobody can push you. So the question is, what do we do with our own region? That is a more important issue. So I'm not too worried about his mediation diplomacy because it's not going to work. But he likes it. And as rightly said, his attention keeps shifting.
Yeah.
So I don't see much problem with that. The problem really is two things. One is the economic. The global economic order is changing. Second, he's also breaking from the alliances.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So NATO, they've become very hostile to Europe. There are a lot of questions about the Indo-Pacific framework, for example. Though the American bureaucratic system is signaling continuity, Trump is signaling
With respect to
discontinuity.
the
Because
the
Chinese-
NDAA versus the the
But
national
Chinese
security
power has
strategy.
grown.
Yeah.
That's the reality. So how America deals with Chinese power, it seemed easier in 10 years ago. It looks much harder.
Yeah.
Therefore, there's going to be a lot more vacillation. So that again takes us back. Look, that brings us back. You can't depend on anyone for your security.
Okay.
While we must continue to work with Americans where we can. Again, the self-strengthening, the internal reform, how do we boost our capabilities? That becomes the core urgency for India. Rather than saying, if the Quad meeting does not take place, that's not the end of the world. The question is, between 24 and 25, have our defense capabilities increased?
Yeah.
Have our economic policies improved? That is the real test, I think. So we got to be prepared for an era of American uncertainty. in the regional security issues.
Yeah.
Could be flips, like in the case of Pakistan, and both on the case of China. So therefore, for us, I think is to become stronger in an uncertain world. That is ultimately the only guarantee. That takes us back to the original thing where we started from.
Right.
More reform, more internal change, so that we can deal with the uncertainty that Trump has introduced.
And Dr. Raja Mohan, I would also, sort of ask you this one question that has also been sort of coming back to me again and again, and especially throughout 2025. What do you make of India's sort of commitment, let's say, to strategic autonomy? Because the way I see the world and the world order, I mean, do you think our room for strategic autonomy is getting narrower?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, look, every country tries to do more autonomy. And that amount of autonomy you can create in a system of sovereign states depends on your strength. A strength could be economic, a strength could be military, a strength could be sometimes just location. North Korea, sitting where it is, has room to do things for strategic autonomy. So in the end, strategic autonomy is not a policy. It is a natural way states behave.
Yeah.
Now the question for us is, if your economy is not doing too well,
Yeah.
if your defense is not fully up to the mark, then you can keep talking about strategic autonomy.
But it does not really
It does
exist.
not mean
Yeah,
anything.
yeah,
So
doesn't mean
therefore,
anything.
again, how do we build yourself up? How do you take advantage of the external situation? Sometimes, how do you neutralize the negative situation that has emerged? For example, if US-China make up, that's a negative outcome. How do you deal with that?
Yeah.
But on the other side, you have US and Russia making up.
But that is
Russia,
a positive outcome
yeah,
for us.
So I think so. There will be more uncertainty. The question then is, your ability to generate more strategic autonomy depends on what you do with your own society,
Right.
with your own economy, with your own defense policies, with your own higher education policies. If you don't internally undertake policies which make you stronger, it's not a foreign policy slogan, strategic autonomy. So we're always ready. But every country is autonomous.
Yeah.
I mean, you see Maldives is also engages China. You see Nepal engages China and you. So this sometimes we create
Bhutan
this.
has also started to unilaterally
absolutely.
engage China. Yes.
So I think we created this illusion somehow strategic autonomy is a special feature of Indian policy.
I think it's
feature of all
become our
countries.
strategic comfort zones.
Look at Pakistan.
Yeah.
He's playing with Chinese and the Americans
Yeah.
at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah.
On Op Sindur, they got the Chinese weapons, they got Americans seemingly stepping in for the field marshal. So I think every country tries to maximize its room for maneuver. And that room for maneuver, how you organize it, depends on your internal strength. I think I would say, as long as we focus on that, strategic autonomy comes by itself.
Okay.
If you're a bigger economy, for a stronger military.
And also just, a bit on multi-alignment, because I think when the world has clear poles, I think multi-alignment fetches you certain benefits. But when everybody is multi-aligning, just like you lose your comparative advantage multi-aligning. So how do you see this going forward? I mean, of course, India coming from the historical experience that we are coming from. But, do you also think that multi-alignment by itself works better as a means and not as an end? Or when it becomes an end, I mean, how do you make sense of it? Because we keep hearing these terms again and again in Indian foreign policy discourse.
There is an algorithm you can create, strategic autonomy, multi-alignment, non-alignment. You put all these words and any gibberish that comes out, which is what is happening. Look, I think we're obsessed with these slogans as a collective, the foreign policy community. Look, you can say multi-alignment. Can you align with China?
Yeah.
When you have a massive border dispute, you have Chinese military sitting on your border and creating challenges for you. What does it mean, multi-alignment? We need good relationship with China. That is that is a logic of geography, right? Whether China is strong or weak, you need a reasonable relationship. We don't have a reasonable relationship with China. Therefore, to say, look, we equally align between America, Russia, and China is meaningless.
Yes.
Because Chinese are sitting on a territory. Yesterday, they declared Arunachal is their core interest.
Even the United States identified that. Yeah.
So there's no meaning to this.
Okay.
It is really, we like, from the time of independence, we're stuck on the word alignment, non-alignment, multi-alignment, alignment 2.0. So I think we're obsessed with that one single phrase, not seeing, look, I mean, you have, for example, on trade, you have $250 billion of trade with Americans.
Yeah.
And barely 10 billion with the Russians, if you remove the oil.
Yeah.
So now, idea that Russia can't be a substitute for the Americans.
But
Russia is some ways useful. You must keep that relationship. But in the end, it is about, I would say, this is about the simplest way of saying all this is independent foreign policy.
Yeah.
That we will pursue our interests depending on how those interests, I define those interests.
Yeah.
But to keep framing it in alignment constantly takes off, confuses people, outside people, confuses ourselves. If there are three major powers today, US, Russia, and China, what does multi-alignment mean? If your trade interests are all with the Americans, Russians, you have some defense interests. With the Chinese, you have problems. So this is actually a slogan with really empty, just a strategic autonomy, which every country is trying to be autonomous. Every country also tries to align with wherever it can. So I would say, again, takes us back to the question, how do you strengthen yourself?
Yeah.
Think of yourself as a growing actor with growing weight, as an independent actor, which can generate policies based on its own interests. So an
Right.
interest-based policy, independent foreign policy is all we're talking about. The slogans are really confuses people.
And is this also something that you've touched upon in your latest book? Because your latest book has also been about that. Why don't you tell the audiences a bit about that?
No, we just done this book on India's role in rebalancing Asia as India becomes a larger economy, as China becomes a power, and the US moving from balancing to engaging China. I think it is this triangular dynamic between India, China, and the US that book looks at. It's called India and the Rebalancing of Asia. There again, I think the main conclusion is how does India strengthen itself to be able to be a stronger player at a time when the relationship between US and China are changing.
So on that note, Dr. Rajamohan, I think it will be safe to say that for whatever we need to unlearn to relearn, I think it all has to start, internally, and it is about reforming ourselves before we sort of give any meaning to whatever foreign policy
So diplomacy
outcome
can
we're
be
looking at.
a complementing factor, a supporting factor. The core is internal. How do you become stronger?
So that has been, I think, the key takeaway from this year-ender special episode for the Worldview with Swasti. Once again, let me thank you for taking the time out, for being so generous and helping everybody understand how to make sense of so much unpredictability around us. Thank you.
Swasti.